linguistic objects, elf machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. Well, we're winding down to the last 3 tapes in this series of podcasts. Those of you who have been with us here in the Psychedelic Salon for a while know that I've been podcasting a series of conversations between Terence McKenna, Ralph Abraham, and Rupert Sheldrake that were held at the Esalen Institute in the fall of 1989 and 1990. And the cassette recordings of these discussions, which the participants called a trialogue, were loaned to me by Ralph Abraham a few months ago, and I've been trying to get at least one tape out each week since then. Now, after we listen to today's trialogue, I'll come back and let you know where we are in the series, and I'll give you a rough idea of what the next month or so of programs will include. But first, let's get on with today's trialogue, in which our intrepid trialoguers approach the topic of the resacularization of the world.
I don't know if I have shared with you the story of my religious training and upbringing. Maybe that will be appropriate for this discussion, as I've heard a little bit about yours. My parents, of course, were derived of some Jewish background, but after some remove of generations, particularly my father. My mother had been a regular temple visitor in her town until she married my father. And since his parents had relocated from New York to the backwoods of Vermont in their youth, they had no connection with any Jewish tradition. So my father was brought up in somewhat of a vacuum. Nevertheless, I think he developed an aversion to organized religion of any sort, and particularly Jewish. I thought he might have forbade the mention or presence of any Jewish religious stuff in the house, but my mother denies this. Anyway, there wasn't any. And in the meanwhile, he developed a kind of religion of his own, which was centered on the family and on a concept of love, which was fairly abstract. So he used to say that love was everything. Occasionally, some circumstance would cause me to be in a church while a service was going on, and then I would look around at the other people with heads bowed when told to bow their heads, thinking, I am the only one who's not casting my eyes down. I am the only one that doesn't believe this stuff. So I don't know if there's a name for this kind of religious upbringing, I guess, total vacuum. Explicitly, my father's idea was, it's better to start when you're an adult, and then you can acquire whatever religious training you want, sort of considering all with an open mind. Now, I never considered all with an open mind and decided whether to have one or none. I just didn't bother to think about it, and then and then I studied, psychoanalysis and music and physics and eventually mathematics that has no relationship to any religious tradition. So eventually the 60s happened, and probably my first experience that I would now identify as a real religious experience was the experience of LSD and whatever intrinsic meaning it carried to me without too much suggestion from the setting, the popular books, and so on. And I immediately thought, as many people did in those days, but not so many today, I think, that this was a religious experience in the true sense of religion, as was probably lost from organized religion, which I knew on the basis of no knowledge or anything, just a guess. Because, of course, I knew people. In fact, practically everybody I did know went to some kind of church, or at least had been brought up with one and formally rejected it. And through them, I got the idea that there was no evidence of any sacred knowledge outstanding in any of these churches. Through, eventually, in the study of art, architecture, music, and so on, I could see in the recent past that there had been a sacred knowledge in the churches of Europe that was embodied in the architecture, the music, and so on. it occurred to me that there might be what I had recently discovered in the form of religion had become extinct only in the recent past in the Western world. Well, these were just idle thoughts, as in these days, in the 60s, we were very preoccupied with politics. Then, when I got to India, I found that this lapse, the extinction of the sacred in organized religion was sort of reduced to zero there, that at least with the jungle babas and so on, you had a live tradition of identification with sacred, what I recognized as sacred at that time, and an easy sharing of the idea of it with the students, the chelas, and so on. And then when I returned from India to California, about the time I met you, Terence, I began to think that there might be some way to revitalize the Western tradition. Of course, other people were speaking about this also, particularly those concerned with Western yoga, the remnants of the adepts of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and so on. And of course, we had our great influence from the Theosophists and the studies of alchemy and so on. But there was still, at this time in 1972, a tremendous separation between political activity, which we were still involved with, particularly around issues of chemical pollution and things like that, on the one hand, and the loss of the sacred in religion on the other hand. I mean, it was more like, it's a shame this pretty thing is gone. Then in the course of time, these came together, and in the suggestion, which now I see many people have made in their books about it, that what's gone wrong in the world now is actually, I mean, a root cause is the loss of the connection to the sacred within and without organized religion. After this connection is made, then political activity has to address this. I mean, if people have different theories of evil, I would call them, whether the loss of the partnership society in 1400 BC or the loss of the sacred in church ritual after the scientific revolution, or the population explosion and the advance of modern medicine in reducing infant mortality and so on. The different theories of evil, because of the strength of the direct experience I had with the sacred, this became and remains my favorite theory of evil. So if I was going to direct myself to some activity to not exactly save the world, but at least to hope in that direction, then I would try to create for some larger portion of humanity the lost thread of connection to the sacred. So this is the program that we have all thought about under the name the resacralization of the world. So as far as I know, there are just a few proposals for any kind of direct action that go in this direction. One is the resumption of rituals not native to us but native to other people that still exist in some kind of live form, such as the shamanism of native tribes. And another idea is the revitalization of existing religion by finding a means to re-attract people to the wonderful churches of the Western world, having not only the shape, the architectural shape, most appropriate for communication with this sacred thread, but also the tradition, the morphic field, the runnel, the creode of this connection, by figuring out through some sort of archaeology of knowledge the missing link. When was it that this went out? For what reason? Was it that the organ replaced singing in the church, or what was it? And whatever it was, to do experiments on bringing it back. And another idea is to remain within the context of Western society, but outside the organized churches. Replace churches with an equivalent institution, perhaps based in the sacred arts, music, architecture, painting, and so on. And another one that we have all given great attention to, and I'm beginning to think too much attention, is the revitalization of science, acknowledging that science has replaced the traditional Christian mythology with its own substitute mythology, and the weaknesses of this mythology are at the root of evil. So those are 4 things I put on my list as top candidates already discussed. And in this connection, we probably should keep in mind the Partnership Society, because there's a connection. I mean, it's suggested, I think, in these works like Leon Eisler's on the Partnership Society, that the disintegration, the devitalization, the decline of the church, of organized religion, of the significance of organized religion, is associated with the patriarchal transformation of society and the embodiment of the patriarchal values within the organized church in the papal hierarchy of the Roman Church and so on, had contributed to the roots of its decline. So my favorite idea at the moment from this list has to do with rituals, these New Year's rituals and so on. I would take the Eleusinian mysteries as a model. And I don't think that everybody should take psychedelics, for example, or have a shamanistic experience in the Amazon jungle in order to reawaken, to rebuild their connection to the divine. But it could be that the churches and their rituals and so on could be reinvigorated by having a certain class of priesthood, as Jesuits and so on, that maybe a new class that specialized in maintaining this connection with the purity of this connection being devoid of any intrinsic cultural overlay. And that could be one component among many. The weaknesses of the scientific mythology could be somehow fixed by incorporating scientific worldview into the church view and so on. So some sort of syncretism between the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian model, including its patriarchal weakness for the moment, trying to repair that in the ways that people are doing in the new church movement. And in the inclusion of the sacrament, at least for a holy elite. The resacralization of music, I think, is very important. If I had to point to a single factor that I thought was destroying society faster than other, it would be evil music. My personal bias. Well, that's my view for a start on the resacralization of society. In short, I'm looking for something beyond the understanding of the virtues of the past that could be the basis of some kind of program in the present, even if it wasn't something that we could do, but something that we could foresee that might happen that would create a successful society here.
Very interesting, Ralph.
Very interesting.
Why don't you just say a tiny bit more about what constitutes evil music?
Well, since Orpheus, Pythagoras, and so on, there has been a permanent tradition of sacred music. And we have sacred music is still played various places, and we have recordings of Gregorian chants and Gurdjieff playing and so on. But the best analysis of the relationship between style in music and style in society that I've come across is Cyril Scott. Cyril Scott is somebody that Janice Rosé pointed out to me. This was a moderately famous composer and pianist in England. And his pieces aren't well known, but he's in a process of rediscovery now. And some people have said, who are serious musical scholars, that he will one day rank with Beethoven. That might be and overvaluation. Anyway, he's an interesting composer. I've heard his music played. And he wrote a book called, I forget, The Harmony of the Spheres or something, in which he analyzed the particular contribution and the evolution of Western society of the various composers. For example, Debussy and Buxtehude and Bach and so on. I don't remember the details. He said, for example, that I think the women's movement, when it began in England, was enabled by Handel. That there's something about Handel which is supportive for political revolution and not for other things. And Beethoven developed the romantic and the emotional in German culture. So this is spelled out in a book. Now, if Cyril Scott were alive today and watched MTV, I'm sure that he would say that this worldview embodied in this music was leading rather than following the decline of the biosphere. And he would see a causal connection. And I think we can take that as a hypothesis that maybe can't be proved. I have no faith in experiments that have been done with music played to plants and so on, although it might be worth a serious review of that literature at some point.
I see what you're saying.
I think that this music is very harmful to the ears. It's much too loud if you go to a concert. It's harmful. It's physically harmful. It's mentally, it's emotionally harmful. And people flock to this. And I think it takes a long time of listening before you get really tired of it. And that has something to do with the starvation of the soul for beauty. The disconnection. This is the aesthetical side of the disconnection of the human species from some sort of divine guidance, which might go under the name of harmony or the world soul or whatever. If you're not in resonance with this world soul, then you can't have a future.
So the aesthetics of the world soul. Well, a lot of what you're saying is you're talking about an archaic revival. These various things that you listed, the resumption of ritual, the revitalization of existing religion. I agree completely with all of this. The only thing that I would add, and I know you agree, is feminism comes in here somewhere in the form of the revitalization of partnership. I'm not entirely clear. Sometimes you seem to be talking about a revitalization of the forms of the 15th and 16th century, and sometimes much further back, like all this business about organs and churches. That's relatively recent stuff.
Well, there's been loss has been going on for 10,000 years.
For a long, long time.
And in different ages past is something that it couldn't be revived in its original form. We may have to use video and film technology.
But so you're saying incremental recovery of the Gaelic perspective.
Well, the value of getting the true partnership into the church would mean that we then didn't have to replace the church just because it had been on the wrong track for 5,000 years.
True.
It has to be
true.
Maybe it's possible to correct without rebuilding the Gothic cathedrals.
But isn't this a little like trying to reform the Soviet Union and keeping the Communist Party around? I think the momentum of these institutions makes them hard to reform.
Well, the organization that collects the money and buys the land and so on might be totally replaced. But I think the architecture is good, as I think that the current music is evil.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Even though an analyst more expert than myself could maybe see dominator forms are built into the actual architecture of many of the cathedrals, I still think it's possible to revive them, that their form would take new meaning because of the life going on inside. If we have to start from scratch figuring out architecture for a partnership society, then that's going to be very difficult. And I don't know if we'll have time to succeed.
Well, I think beginning with a revival of Gothic cathedral building in the high metriological style of Chartres sounds just fine. I certainly think that the Romanesque style is a dominator style and a ponderous and uncomfortable way to do it. But I love the Gothic and Gothic revival. I mean, this is a celebration of vegetation and lightness and air and...
Well, my own sentiments exactly. I mean, I'm very interested to hear this proposal of Ralph's, because it's something that I've formulated starting from a different point of view and try to follow. Because as a practicing member of the Church of England, I obviously think that there's a value in the traditional continuity of the institution. I also believe that the way forward is, since it's obvious that organised religion is at one of its lowest ebbs ever, this in a sense creates an extraordinary openness and possibility for change. And I think that one of the ways in which modern Christianity could reconnect with the same sort of sources of inspiration that gave rise to the Gothic cathedrals is partly through the Gothic cathedrals themselves, which, at least in England and throughout the whole of Europe, are all still there. I mean, practically all of them are still functioning, and they still have sacred chants going on in them every day, prayers offered up on a regular cycle, just as great temples should have. They're continuously active sacral places that have been sacral for centuries and lead us to a position would at least connect us with the kind of ancestral psyche, because they're still functioning. They put us into that particular model of the cosmos that they had. The cathedrals, like temples, are models of the cosmos, and they have all the things that interest us in them in a way. I mean, there's the vegetation principle. There are gargoyles and protector spirits. There are green men, these mysterious vegetation gods that burst out everywhere in this mysterious way. They're usually dedicated, the greatest ones are dedicated to Our Lady, who was seen in various forms, particularly the form of Our Lady of Wisdom and Sophia in the Middle Ages. And they have in their windows geometrical designs. They have threefold mandalas, fourfold mandalas, fivefold mandalas, and then there are rose windows with these extremely complex psychedelic mandala things with all these stained glass windows. They have all these qualities. So they're one way, I think, of reconnecting us with the sacred places of Europe, and they connect us to the places and also to the traditional cycle of festivals. So I think that's one important route. I think another important route is through the practice of festivals in general, the sacralization of time, which some Jewish people are doing through revitalizing the tradition of the Sabbath, and the Friday evening lighting the candles with the invocation of the Sabbath bride or the Shekinah, the feminine principles involved in the home and in space and time and in the world and in embodied existence. And anyway, the sacralization of time is another way that can reconnect us with these traditions. And I think the most important aspect of this process, really, because I agree with Terence about the archaic revival, is to find behind the existing forms and existing festivals the pre-Christian roots, which in all cases are the ones that feed the particular timing of the festivals and the particular locations of the sacred places, and which ground the new religion in the old, and connect it through the present tradition as it still goes on. There's a continuous living strand in the tradition that goes right back to the pre-Christian shamanic societies of Europe. So I think that this is a connection that can still work. It works for me. I find it actually works, this connection. I find it does make me feel that I do have an affinity with the cathedrals in the High Middle Ages, and also with the particular places. But then obviously the whole thing has to be tied in with, if this continued sacralization of space and time involves recognizing the importance of sacred places everywhere, of every kind, including the hills and the high places and the sacred groves and the national parks and so on. So it would involve a much more animistic version of Christianity or Judaism, and it would involve the process that I've come to think of as the greening of God, this new greening of God process that's going on. It's theologians who've revived the whole tradition of Hildegard von Bingen and the greening process, and this whole hidden strand of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which may never have been a majority strand, but even as a minority strand can be used to authenticate, feed, and give life to a burgeoning of that aspect of the thing. No, when that's what's needed.
Yes, well, it seems, Ralph, you're sort of advocating this. I find
well,
it...
I'm asking, is it possible? I'm not sure.
Well, what I was going to say was, McLuhan said it was inevitable in the sense that he had this notion that he called electronic feudalism, and he felt that the consequence of the shift from illiterate phonetic alphabet cultures, which existed for us as recently as the 1940s, that the replacing of it with electronic forms of media would have an effect on the ratio of the senses, and that the new ratio created by electronic media would be most similar to the ratio of the senses that existed in medieval Europe before the invention of printing. He based this on the idea that before the linear uniformity of print, you had to actually look at manuscript, because every manuscript was different, because it reflected the hand of its author. And that after print was invented, people no longer looked, they read. And this was a very different function where you don't actually study each E and L, you generalize. With television and electronic media, you're again returned to the situation where you must look, you must assemble out of a gestalt an image. You cannot read it. And he felt that the consequences of this shift in the sense ratio would be global and immense, that it would cause the fragmentation and dissolution of the nation state, which we certainly seem to be seeing in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and that it would return people to a kind of pietistic fundamentalism, homebound, because electronic media brings information to you, and that all of these factors would conspire to create an era in which the Gothic model would be very strongly expressed. I, from my own point of view, with the theory of the time wave, see this coming in the mid-90s and expect it to be very strong, and it will have many aspects in the same way that the Middle Ages are certainly an ambiguous period of time. I mean, the glory of the Gothic cathedrals is one side of it, but it was a time of wandering flagellance, pestilence, bigotry, suppression of women, hatred of outsiders, insularity, provincialism, barbarism, so forth and so on. But I think we're in an excellent position from McLuhan's point of view and from my own reasoning from entirely different premises to experience something very much like what you're advocating. And I, for one, look forward to it.
Well, I think the conditions under which this transformation could somehow take place would require, first of all, the decentralization, that one of the most patriarchal aspects of the church is the monolithic, centralized government of it. And just as there's the local movements, the little national movements for the resumption of languages such as Welsh and so on, and the return of the Slavic, the Baltic states to local control and so on, I think also the churches would have to be returned to local languages in order that their festivals could relate to the local hills, wells and trees and so on. And then on this local basis, the partnership of men and women emerging as a parallel movement within the society would, in the context of this emerging partnership, the locally controlled churches would then be transfigured so that their festivals had a new meaning and took place on the locally appropriate days and so on. I mean, that's just one level that people would have to value their local church. Maybe they would have dances in it and actually have their marriages in it, and so on. And a lot of rituals would have to be rewritten, and then there would have to be scholarship as to the proper relationship of the ritual and the place. And then there would have to be journals where the scholarship was published or something, and then there would have to be an educational system, something like Sunday school, where this new stuff or old stuff was taught. And it could be that the society is much too rigid for any of these necessary conditions to be created.
What you've just described sounded much more like a model of the Anglican Church than the Roman Catholic. I mean, the Anglican Church has autonomous, each country has its own. The Church of England is the English Church, there's a Church in Wales, there's the Church of Ireland, there's the Episcopalian Church of the US, the Episcopalian Church of Canada, and then in all these African countries they have their own. There with black bishops, and in each case, each church is autonomous. And some have decided to ordain women and have done so, like the Episcopalian Church in the United States and Canada and in New Zealand. Some have not decided to do so yet, like in England. And so there's a kind of pluralism of each finds its own way. Now, it's not the thing is, it's quite a flexible model. I think Anglicanism doesn't have the same problems with the Pope and the strong tradition of authority. It's a much more autonomous church, and in its organisation each bishop has a high degree of autonomy, and each parish priest does too. So it's in his own parish. So that's one model, and it's not the only one. It's not a perfect one, but it's one.
But you've also said that religion, organized religion, is at its lowest ebb, and I think you told me that attendance in churches and Anglican churches in England is at its lowest ebb.
It's now running at slightly under 2% of the population.
2%.
2%.
So somehow the flexibility of this system, which does indeed sound ideal for the purpose I'm describing in this fantasy, is actually of no use, has no attraction to people. And so what would be necessary in order to reverse this trend, to make it really of obvious benefit to go there?
Well, you might first ask, is it worth doing? In America, attendance at church is much higher, and it convulses the body politic because, unable to fulfill its sacral function, the church has become simply a ruthless lobbying force for fundamentalist social policy. So, I think new institutions, in your first statement you suggested replacement. I think we should
build some new
level to the ground and start over, at least in America. The Anglican Church, I think its great virtue, as I understand it, is that it's fairly harmless. But in America, religion leads to hangings, in my experience.
Well, the Episcopal Church in America in particular, since Rupert said they're ordaining women, that seems to be a really major change. And maybe if this were the case in England, which I gather it is not
yet, but it
then
may
it
well
might be gradually increasing rather than decreasing attendance in church.
Well, I think the reason why, I think the main reasons for people attending churches would have to do with an appreciation of collective participation in ritual, appreciation of the benefit of established forms and a continuous tradition, and appreciation of sacred place. Now, I think that these are three strong arguments for going to services. You're taking place in a traditional ritual at a sacred place which has a validity and a tradition behind it. Now, I think any replacement of the Church of England or of churches as institutions, if it were to be effective, and if it were to sacralize political life, would have to be more than just vast numbers of proliferating tiny cults. It would have to be more than that. It wouldn't really work if it were like the religious landscape of Southern California, with its sort of divisive cultism. There would have to be a certain validity to it where it could authenticate
It would have to have a valid mission.
The power of the ruler and the power of the political system, and validate the entire workings of the body politic. For that, you need something like an established church. And one of the problems of the United States is it doesn't have one, and it can't have one for constitutional reasons. So there's very little way in which the political life in America could be sacralized, since by definition it's secular. Now, so there's a different problem here in America, but say in Britain, consider this possibility. There is in fact already an established church which fulfills many of the traditional sacralizing roles. It's the custodian of the great sacred places of England, the great cathedrals and many other, Glastonbury Abbey, all these places, under the custody of the established church, which on the whole fulfills this role extremely well, maintains their sacrality and so on. Now, say that this is abolished, or simply allowed to wither and disappear, and say one wants to replace it with another institution which would be able to exert a widespread claim to validity through all classes of society. How would one go about doing it? I mean, the one reason I don't think that's a feasible route to follow is that I think you'd simply have a proliferation of endless small cults or sects, and that you'd be left with a secular authority and a whole secular official life which was thoroughly desacralized.
Well, one answer might be you have to find a religious mission of sufficient consequence to command that kind of loyalty.
In mythology, you need a unifying principle, an attractor.
This fellow that I mentioned, Dave Brower of the Sierra Club, he actually said, to save the earth, we need an outbreak of religious mania that would dwarf Islam. This is an idea which can send millions on the move. This is the new idea. It counts above everything, and it will sweep across national borders and topple dynasties and melt away empires. And this is what got him tossed out of the Sierra Club. I mean, he called for a jihad to save the earth. And I think, this kind of thing is worth considering. The other thing I wanted to say is I'm a very big fan of the archaic revival, but as we talk about a new feudalism and look around the earth, we might ask ourselves, where is it that an archaic revival is actually underway, and how is it going? And the obvious example is Iran, where, people took archaic revival seriously, took old religious forms seriously, the importance of resuming old rituals, the importance of returning to tried and true ways. And it's, I don't think, not what we had in mind.
Well, they returned to a time when the sacred thread was already broken.
You mean the 14th century or something like that?
I mean, the essence here is the actual connection to the sacred. And I think now we can't have an archaic revival by going backwards exactly. We have to do our archaeology of knowledge to the point where we understand what the essence of it was, and to revive that would mean to bring it into modern forms. It would have to acknowledge, for example, that the total population of the planet is larger now than then. That means that recycling is mandatory. That means that green consciousness, Gaia, hypothesis consciousness, would have to actually play a leading role in the actual rituals performed on the various days and so on. Mm-hmm. So the mandate, I think, to create a new mythology that could organize different styles of churches on a path of convergent evolution would be one that was intrinsically attractive, because it actually offered a reversal of the present trend that was somehow obvious to people.
What about resacralization through religion as a slogan? I mean, it would come to many people as being a new idea.
Well, the churches would have to be taken over. I mean, where you have still a church government, a government that's excommunicating preachers for acknowledging the equality of women or something, is just too far removed from the current state of what the average person in our society knows to be attractive.
I think the thing is that religious reform has to come through a movement actually getting going and being practiced, and through example. And, it could spread. Either one could have the growth of a new religion, like, say, an ayahuasca church or something like that, spreading spontaneously, an entirely new thing. But sooner or later, I think to gain any authority, it would have to undergo a kind of syncretism with the existing structures of religion. And it could be reinvigorated in that way. That's one way it could happen.
So localization of control of the church would aid this process?
It would aid the process, yes. But I mean, the only other way it could happen, as far as I could see, would be through neo-pagan religious movements starting up in various ways. They'd then have to go back further than the sacred Christian sites. They'd have to connect with Aboriginal sites.
Well, that would be this jihad to save the earth, an outbreak of paganism.
But the thing is that paganism emerging in a post-Christian context would be so heavily flavoured with Christianity that one could say that it was a kind of neo-Christian paganism.
Well, then shamanism, the yet further back
Well, jihads are not present in shamanism in the same way, I shouldn't think. The thing is that jihad is a particular model with Jewish roots, perfected most by Islam, whose colour, incidentally, is green. If one says that the green movement should have a jihad, one has to remember that all the shrines of the saints and the colour of the prophet is green. But jihads come out of the whole sort of Judaic crusade, jihad, Jewish holy wars and so on. That's for the particular field from which the concept comes.
Mm-hmm.
And a green mass movement, you see, the most natural thing in a place like California would have decentralized movements of small cults, each with their following, a kind of entrepreneurial cult economy, with no dominating giants, and probably some secular antitrust laws to stop any of them getting too big. But that wouldn't cause a mass movement. A mass movement, a crusade or a jihad, requires a much more unified movement.
I think convergent evolution is a gentler way to go. I think that there's a real gap, a conflict between these two different strategies of starting a new system based on the archaic revival or pagan revival on the one hand, and revolution of the churches, resacularization by religion on the other hand. And that has to do with traditional church practice of denying the validity of previous forms, archaic pagan forms, and particularly carried to the point of revising history. Pulverizing goddess figurines and statues and so on. What would be necessary besides partnership of the genders, local control, a green politic, and so on within the ritual of the church would be an acknowledgement of the validity of the essential religiosity of the pagan forms, including the goddess, the worship of idols, and so on.
And the psychedelic.
And that means that the Bible might have to be, here it is, abandoned. The Bible might have to be abandoned as sacred document of the church.
No, reinterpreted.
Reinterpreted. Okay.
That's a process that goes on continually, and the whole development of the Christian religion, like any other, depends on a series of reinterpretations of traditional texts. So the reinterpretation that's going on right now is through the process theologians, an attempt to develop the idea of an evolutionary God, of an evolutionary universe. That's one major strand of theological reinterpretation. And they have a very strong case, because the God of the Old Testament is not a Platonic, transcendent God outside history. He's a thoroughly hands-on, interactive God who's present within history, even arranging details, like the passage through the Red Sea. This is an interactive process. It's an ongoing providence that's guiding the historical process. That's the Jewish conception of God, a kind of process God, they would say, and I think they're right, that this is in fact the true Judeo-Christian conception. So a process evolutionary model is one revolution going on in theology. Another is the recovery of the feminine and a recovery of the tradition of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. Sophia, the holy wisdom, is the feminine wisdom principle, which is it could fulfill many of the roles of the world soul, which is feminine. A revival of that whole tradition. These revolutions are actually occurring in theology right now.
I guess I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to parts of the conversation we just heard, because every time they start talking about organized religion, well, my blood began to boil just thinking about how those institutions have caused so much death and destruction that I miss what the people are saying next. So I did like Terrence's suggestion, by the way, though, of leveling all the churches to the ground. I'd like to think that he was talking about the institutions themselves and not the old buildings, because I think that some of those old churches would make a great location for a rave. Just imagine a giant rave being held in all of the major churches of the world all at the same time. Now that, I think, would be a way to begin the resacularization of the world, don't you think? Another way, of course, is to continue doing what I know a lot of you are already doing, and that is to create your own personal ceremonies and rituals for various days, like the solstice gatherings and full moon parties that seem to be sprouting up all over the place. I've been quite fortunate to have participated in several of these new homegrown festivals, and I always feel better about life afterwards. So keep the flame going, you ritual pioneers. I'm really convinced that each time you conduct another little ceremony like that, you deepen the creode of the new basin of attraction that our psychedelic community is working so hard to create. And speaking of basins of attraction, there's a strong attractor starting to take shape in Costa Rica right now, and that is the focus on the 2007 Mind States Conference that John Hanna has planned. Now, you can find the details about this at mindstates.org, but here's a little detail that you probably won't find on the website. Just before I started recording this podcast, I received the following information in an email that John sent out. And he said, for a short period of time, I am offering a 10% discount off of the early bird price to those people who are willing to put down a 50% deposit, that's $585, on or before February 15th, and pay the remaining 50% on or before April 1st. This benefits you by allowing an additional $130 off of the conference cost, and also by allowing for the payment to be made in 2 installments, creating less expense all at once. Now, by the way, the price, he doesn't say this in his email, but the price of the conference includes not only the speakers, but also meals and a room at the 2,000-acre eco-resort where the conferences will be held. And while I can't vouch for the food there, what I can say about events like this is that the community meals are where a lot of the magic takes place. It was at a similar event where I first met the Shulgins when they came and sat down at a table where I was eating with a couple of new friends that I just met. Now, there's just something about these conferences that take place outside the States that make them stand out. You know, maybe it's because they're smaller and thus more intimate, or maybe it's simply because once you get out of this oppressively heavy vibe here in the U.S., life just seems a little lighter and more worth living. Anyway, if you're interested in attending a conference like this, well, I think this may be your only chance in 2007, so don't wait too long if you're being called. Now, where was I? Oh, yeah, John's email. After mentioning the discount deal, he then went on to say that in the past he's had a sponsor who helped him with the upfront costs, like putting up the deposit for the hotel and things like that. But this year he's on his own, and so he's doing this limited time discount offer to help with his upfront expenses. That's the reason for all this, I guess. So if you plan on attending, here's a way to save some money and to help John out as well. He's certainly done more than his share of the heavy lifting for many of us who never would have met had it not been for a Mind States conference. And speaking of John's conferences, I received an email from Iwol who said, "Now don't get me wrong, I do like the trialogues, but I also like to hear more of the other speakers you featured in the salon. So how about breaking up the trialogues with some more of those mind states talks now and then? Well, I will. You've got a good point. But I also don't want to break the flow of this first series of trialogues. So here's my plan for the next month or so. There are 10 tapes in the first series, and we'll finish tape 8 in the next podcast. And then next week, I'll do tape 9 and then do the last tape the following week. Then we'll take a short break from the trialogues, and I'll get out a few more of this year's Palenque Norte talks from Burning Man. I know that I've got Mark Pesci's talk and Amanda Fielding's talk ready to go, and I think there are a couple more that I didn't get out yet as well. And as for the trialogues, as you may remember from the first podcast in the trialogue series, these conversations were held somewhat regularly from 1989 through 1998. And thanks to Ralph Abraham, we've got copies of almost all of them. But here's what I thought might be the most interesting way to listen to them. Are you ready for this? How about backwards? No, not that kind, although maybe it would be interesting to see if there's any hidden messages that we might hear by playing a McKenna rap backwards. But I didn't mean that kind of backwards. What I'm thinking about is that instead of just listening to the rest of these programs after this first series in chronological order, it might be more interesting to jump right to the last one, the one they did in 1998. And since there were about 10 years between that trialogue and the ones we're hearing now, I'm wondering if their positions have changed, or just where their conversation drifted to over the intervening years. Of course, the danger here is that we might learn that they didn't have anything new to say after the passage of all that time. But my guess is that that won't be the case. Well, it's time to wrap up for today, but before I go, I should again mention that this and all of the podcasts from the Psychedelic Salon are protected under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 2.5 license. And if you have any questions about that, you can click on the link at the bottom of the Psychedelic Salon webpage, which may be found at matrixmasters.com/podcast. And if you still have questions, you can send them in an email to lorenzo@matrixmasters.com. And just so that you know, the reason for the Creative Commons license is to make this material more available, not to restrict it. Just check out the creativecommons.org website and you'll see what I mean. And thanks again to the good folks from Chateau Hayuk for letting us use your music here in the Psychedelic Salon. And for now, this is Lorenzo, signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.
Linguistic object. Help machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. In case you're joining us here for the first time, I guess I should point out that for the past few weeks I've been playing some recordings that were made at the Esalen Institute in the fall of 1989 and again in 1990. The tapes of these conversations, which the participants called a trialogue, were loaned to me by Ralph Abraham, who is one of the participants in these discussions, the other two being Terence McKenna and Rupert Sheldrake. So far, we've heard them talk about topics that run the gamut from creativity and chaos to imagination, the world soul, and entities from other dimensions. Today, we're going to hear the second side of the 8th tape in the series, which is titled The Resacularization of the World. And we'll pick up where Ralph Abraham was discussing the fact that organized religions should acknowledge the validity of the so-called pagan forms of worship that had preceded them.
I think convergent evolution is a gentler way to go. I think that there's a real gap, a conflict between these two different strategies of starting a new system based on the archaic revival or pagan revival on the one hand, and revolution of the churches, resacularization by religion on the other hand. And that has to do with traditional church practice of denying the validity of previous forms, archaic pagan forms, and particularly carried to the point of revising history. I mean, pulverizing goddess figurines and statues and so on. What would be necessary besides partnership of the genders, local control, a green politic, and so on within the ritual of the church would be an acknowledgement of the validity of the essential religiosity of the pagan forms, including the goddess, the worship of idols, and so on.
And the psychedelic.
And that means that the Bible might have to be, here it is, abandoned. The Bible might have to be abandoned as sacred document of the church.
No, reinterpreted.
Reinterpreted. Okay.
That's a process that goes on continually, and the whole development of the Christian religion, like any other, depends on a series of reinterpretations of traditional texts. So the reinterpretation that's going on right now is through the process theologians an attempt to develop the idea of an evolutionary God, of an evolutionary universe. That's one major strand of theological reinterpretation. And they have a very strong case, because the God of the Old Testament is not a Platonic, transcendent God outside history. He's a thoroughly hands-on, interactive God who's present within history, even arranging details like the passage through the Red Sea. You know, this is an interactive process. It's an ongoing providence that's guiding the historical process. That's the Jewish conception of God, a kind of process God. They would say, and I think they're right, that this is in fact the true Judeo-Christian conception. So a process evolutionary model is one revolution going on in theology. Another is the recovery of the feminine and a recovery of the tradition of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. Sophia, the holy wisdom, is the feminine wisdom principle, which is it could fulfill many of the roles of the world soul, which is feminine. And a revival of that whole tradition. These revolutions are actually occurring in theology right now.
Well, is there a tradition of Old Testament scholarship that can reinterpret stories about David and Melchizedek or Jericho? I mean, all these...
Oh, well, they're all being reinterpreted all the time. Melchizedek is, according to Father Bede's reinterpretation of it, the figure of the cosmic priest, who represents the priesthood of the cosmic religion, which is the root of all religion. And that's the religion which links us to the feature of the cosmos, to the earth and to the heavens, and to the cosmic revelation. And this is also implicit in the Old Testament, you see, because Noah, who is saved by God after this catastrophe, is given the promise, the rainbow. The rainbow is the sign of the cosmic covenant between God and Noah. But Noah isn't a Jew. He's the only man and woman. His family is the only family that survives the flood, and he's like the new Adam. He's the father of all humanity, of all races. It's only much later that you get to Abraham and the founding father of the Jews. So Noah is a generic father of humanity, and so there's a cosmic covenant of Noah, which is the basis of all cosmic religion, and one can trace that in the Bible. So it's not impossible, and in fact it's already being done, to reinterpret the Bible. It's always being reinterpreted. So one place would be getting rid of it, the other would be reinterpreting it, but the route that will be followed within the organic development of religion is reinterpretation.
So it's going on, then. Is that basis of optimism about the future of our civilization?
Well, I think it's going on. I think it's going on to some extent. I think it needs to go on a great deal more. And you see, I think that if one's going to have a syncretism, one has to have things that can grow together. And there's no way in which a more priestess-based feminist element could grow together with this tradition than if it came into being. I mean, it has to come into being. And if the thing that can raise people to the barricades of this jihad, this green crusade, is the flag of Gaia. I mean, that seems to be the unifying banner of the present movement. It's the goddess Gaia. It's the Great Mother. And as soon as you mention that it's the Great Mother, a lot of people start going off the idea, which is why the Gaia hypothesis is preferred by many of its proponents to be veiled in the obscurity of an antique tongue as Gaia rather than Mother Earth. Because Mother Earth reminds people of mothers and then of their own mother, and tends to press buttons which many people would rather not have pressed when thinking about such abstract issues as the future of humanity on the globe. But that's the trouble with these metaphors, or the strength of them, that they do connect you with these concrete realities of experience. Anyway, if there were to be a true Mother Earth religion developed, it would obviously have priestesses rather than priests, because its central figure is a goddess. It would be relating human life to the earth, first and foremost. And it would tend to, then, our bodies return to the earth. It would get into the whole material cycles. It wouldn't have much emphasis on the stars or the heavens. And I think it would be very claustrophobic for a lot of people before very long. And people would want a religion that also brought in the aspiration for the stars, the heavens, the greatness of the cosmos, the space of the heavens. Then you'd have the choice of religious things. Is there a god of the heavens, or is there a goddess of the heavens?
Well, in ancient Egypt there was a goddess of the heavens who arched over the body of the earth.
And Christianity, in response to that particular question, offers one a choice of either. Because God the Father is the Father in heaven, is traditionally the sky god. He's the sky god figure. But also, Our Lady is Queen of Heaven, having taken on the connotations of Astarte and the sky goddesses of the Near East. And her robe, of course, is blue in colour, coloured with stars. So she's, in a sense, the soul, the womb
the anima mundi.
She's the anima mundi, or the soul of the world. So these are different models. There are different models on the market, as it were, already within the tradition.
But if this anima mundi thing got going, this is not a fine-tuning of Christianity. This is, at last, the overthrow of it. It's hard to paint.
Let's call it a revolution.
Yes, a revolution, an absolute, no more this patriarchal, masculine dominator thing that has descended down through monotheism. I mean, it would be the pluralities.
Well, I think it would, in the Middle Ages, in fact, the anima mundi was a widely known concept.
It almost broke out, but then it was suppressed.
But it was compatible with the form of the Christian church they had at that time. The Aristotelian view of nature was entirely animistic. The Middle Ages had a form of animistic Christianity.
But they exterminated all this.
No, their church didn't exterminate it. The Protestant Reformation tried to exterminate it, and the Scientific Revolution carried that process further. But here's where you have to distinguish very sharply between the Protestant tradition and the Catholic tradition.
True.
Well, we've done a good work here. We've dreamed a dream. We've visioned a revolution of religion in which there would be priests and priestesses and the acceptance of psychedelics as a sacrament among some, and local control and renewal of meaning in rites and rituals and so on. Unfortunately, we've still got the continual decrease of attendance in these churches, and the fact that the revival might already be underway with the reinterpretation of the Bible and so on is going to be of no great use unless, as a matter of fact, it becomes attractive, which I think it's not. There's somehow a pretty strong habit of revulsion at churches, of hatred for churches and all the sins of the church over these past centuries. Plus, there's the competition of scientism as a new mythology, which is totally disjoint from the church and which has so many errors built into it as far as sensitivity to planet and all the Gaia and green concerns, that the syncretism of the revived church with science would not be possible without destroying the revived church. So somehow this competitor, so attractive because of the strength of his weapons and so on, the mythology of scientism, this would have to be dealt with, or other factors, whatever they are, which disincline people to be attracted to church, which makes church a repeller for them, whether revised or not. What could be done in the way of education, media, what could be done to reverse this?
So you see the reason for the lack of attraction of the church is the presence of an alternative attractor, as it were, namely the worldview of scientism.
Well, we read
which is rather like the person, one of the big pluses of scientism emotionally for people is, which I had, since I was a convert to scientism at about age 14, I know very well, is that a bit like you, I mean, one can look around and everybody else is praying or appearing to pray, but one can somehow see from a higher point of view, because from the point of view of scientism, all this is just superstition. Man has risen beyond it through the advance of science and technology, and we're superior to the whole of religion, which is infantile and part of the past. I mean, this is part of the worldview of scientism, and I agree that, religious revival depends on a collapse of faith in scientism. But I think that collapse of faith is happening all around us. Old-style humanists, secular humanists, the campaigning atheist types, a thing of the past. I mean, there's still a few of the older ones around, and in America you still find them. But you don't find them much in England, because there's no longer much to fight against. It's not as if society is totally strangled by the power of the church. That's very far from being the case. It's dominated far more by banks, financial institutions, military complexes. In marginal areas it may be affected by the church, but for all intents and purposes it's free of its control. So scientism is, I think, losing its impetus. There's a widespread public disillusionment with science, which is reflected in cuts in funding for scientific research and closing of science institutions, which is actually happening.
But this just leaves people stranded, having rejected the church in favor of science and having rejected science in favor of nothing. It leaves us with the dilemma of today.
Well, that leaves the void into which...
Why not psychedelicize and sacralize green politics, which otherwise is in the hands of a very boring bunch of materialist, breast-beating, neo-Marxists.
A clever conspiracy between green politics and a revived church.
Well, I would say that science and green politics can be sacralized through the psychedelic experience. Rupert's example of seeing everyone bowed with their head in prayer, and from the point of view of scientism, knowing that this is all superstition. But the next level up is the psychedelic person who knows that the scientist dismissing the people bowed in prayer is a poor fool. And so it's... I think that green politics, that what makes it so wishy-washy is its lack of a forthright metaphysic, and that they insist that they're rationalists, reformed socialists, saw-the-light Marxists, and all this other stuff. And none of that is good enough to inspire anybody. But a green party that used a mystical language, a psychedelic language, a language of integration and control and emotion and all this, would have, I think, a tremendous appeal. That's why Rupert is so keen for this ayahuasca cult coming out of Brazil, because on one level it's simply preserve the rainforest, help out little people, your typical bleeding heart rap. But on another level, it's a psychedelic religion that makes claims on the imagination, the heart, the soul.
So here's an attractive partnership, green plus psychedelic. How about the Eleusinian mysteries celebrated in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine? Something
yes,
of that
plant
scale.
Psychedelic. It has to be understood that that this is the way to the guy in mind, that these things are sacraments, not metaphors for sacraments, real sacraments, and that their efficaciousness can have political consequences if the two forces are brought together. Everybody's going to try and out-green everybody else. The trick will be to tell the weasels from everybody else.
No, but they very well might outgreen each other within the current context of desacralization, resulting in only a slight extension of time. You see that it's a huge system, and green is not enough, to recycle the plastic bottles. It's not enough to stop cutting down the Amazon jungle. It only earns a slight extension in the time available to evolve a better strategy for all the rest, the root, the population explosion, for example, the exhaustion of the energy resources.
This is what will give force to the call for fanatical vigilance. It really is a thing that is ready-made for fanaticism, because people used to say, if God is on your side, what fears do you need to do? Well, if what your mission is to save the earth, it's very hard to see how you're going to negotiate compromises with people who don't want to save the earth.
Well, the answer is you have a range of people like you have in the environmental movement. You have Earth Firsters who are prepared to go furthest. They're the kind of radical terrorists.
The commandos.
Yes. And then you have other groups like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, which has now become more moderate, prepared to negotiate with the powers that be. But it's the extremists who set the agenda, and then the others can only moderate.
In the wake.
Yes, the others can only moderate in the wake. And I think that's the right-wing think tanks in Britain and America have shown us in the last 10 years, how a few people thinking out extreme policy options, or as they call them, future scenarios. Just 20, 30 people think out these sort of programs like privatizing things and so on. And then they set the agenda. Then there's sort of more moderate institutes that when the debates and being stirred up, and the whole attention of the debaters shifted over in that direction through creating that as an option, the debate. Then a more moderate institute works out the details and they get it achieved.
Well, this is classical revolutionary theory. If 30 people were willing to wage unconditional warfare against anyone who opposed saving the earth, headlines would follow, huge debate in the media, the immediate softened position directly behind them, the further softened position. Everybody would have to be heard from, like these people who blow up lumber trucks and dynamite railroads that are used to bring the wood out of the forest. I mean, this is all theater.
Well, basically, this sounds splendidly optimistic. The bad news is good news. The magnitude of the problem guarantees a response. The response will probably succeed. The successful Green Party will automatically negotiate a new partnership with the reinterpreted church. But frankly, I just can't imagine a holy war resulting in a peaceful partnership society.
Well, I think that this is a very desperate situation. The hope would be that faced with the possibility of a holy war, they would just abdicate. And the existing institutions would say, all right, we'll save the earth already. Rather than being hung, we'll save the earth. Sorry we didn't move faster, didn't quite understand what you were signaling. Now we've got it. Now we'll save the earth. By threatening them with chaos, absolute turmoil.
But anyway, this green movement, if it's to be effective as a political movement, must have a spiritual and a mystical dimension. And I think that's where the question comes in of how would it acquire one without either allying itself to a greened form of Christianity or Judaism, or without inventing its own kind of priestess or priesthood and carrying out its own rituals. Now, frankly, I don't see the latter happening. I can't imagine the green politicians in Germany and Britain.
Psychedelics is the obvious alternative.
Well, I think there's a
because it's an
time scale problem, because the crisis is coming upon us with the speed of a tidal wave. I think that in the long run it'll be compared to the deluge. It's the flood, and the abdication of the great institutions of society from their present position and the rate at which they can jump onto the green bandwagon is quite fast compared to the time it will take to revitalize the church, to reinterpret the Bible, to obtain new sacred music, to institutionalize the priest and priestesshood of psychedelic exploration, and so on. And that people had really better get moving, I think, in the revitalized church movement if they want to be on the bandwagon at all.
Well, there are probably, if it's to be a psychedelicized green movement, the people who could lead it have been training themselves for years. They just didn't understand that's what they were training themselves for. But called upon to do so, they could step forward and operate in those positions.
But I think your idea of an order, within, you had this model of the Franciscans and so on. What it would be, the best model would be one of the, like the Franciscan order.
Yes,
which would be a kind of autonomous local chapters loosely affiliated with the church, not in opposition to it, working loosely within it, and therefore being able to affect the whole network of it. And
so a priesthood of greens, especially the psychedelic committee, would keep track.
The psychedelic order.
The psychedelic order, or a green order. It would be a green order. And I think it would be very interesting to see what happened. I think it would have to have an ecumenical quality. In other words, I think it would have to be linked up to a green order of Judaism, because I think they'd have to work closely together. If this movement's to work, it's to be one where the Judaic tradition, and the Christian ones develop together, I think, in this process in the West. Because I don't think that it would work otherwise. Because so many influential people in Western society are Jewish. And if they're always going to be pulled towards the sort of old-style Zionist view of Israel and stuff as the sort of ultimate in world politics, it's not going to be very helpful. And so to come into this broader vision, I think there'd have to be green Christian and Jewish movements, different orders.
Yes, different orders, but there need to be green mystical orders associated with every religion that among themselves would have no discrepancy as to their view, based as it is upon this pure channel.
Right.
And therefore that would serve as a kind of neural network connecting up into a new unity, all of these presently very diverse systems.
That's right. The big green orders of Islam, green orders of Hinduism. And the green orders...
Neo-Sufi and Neo-Kabbalah.
That's right. And the green order in America would have as one of its roles the reconnection with the sacred places of America and their re-honoring and appropriate ceremonies. And the green order in England would have its role of connecting with the sacred places, and it would obviously...
So rather than a green party, a green order party is too much of
the party has already happened.
Well, the party is already there, but there should be a green order.
Is missing, and now I think we're summarizing our discussion into an actual proposal for a way that some of these goals could be obtained in a reasonable time. And that is through the establishment of a neural network, intercommunicating orders associated to the same sacrament all over the planet. The entire promise of the intellect has failed us. If it's necessary for the catastrophe to actually be upon us before people will act. And yet that seems to be the case. About nuclear power, for example, there's a small number of people who will stand up at the barricades and so on, but the majority of people will still continue to buy nuclear power. And it's really too late to wait until the tidal wave crashes on the shore. There will be no response.
No, we have
to mobilize. For a lot of things, it's already too late. The death of species, or 30% of the species, and so on. I mean, the numbers, the state of advance of the death of the biosphere is already so great that the jihad would be upon us if people were able to understand what they read and to project what that means and to respond with their heart.
So what they need are people and organizations which give permission to do that, and then their anger will rise. They won't have to be told what to do. They will know what to do if you just connect it up for them. They'll be furious.
Well, I think that part of the problem is the denial of the problem. And part of the denial is the corruption of the news media in not reporting the news.
Well, and the corruption of science on one level. I mean, for instance, this whole greenhouse thing, they've been hemming and hawing for 15 years, saying, yes, we now do detect, and it is true. It's no longer about colder, warmer. It's happening. We're aboard. We're taking this out of the hands of the mystics and the chicken littles and saying, yes, we, hard-headed university scientists, we agree.
Well, just as the organized religion needs revolution and reinterpretation, science also needs revolution and reinterpretation. And the Gaia hypothesis and its accompanying revolution in the sciences has forced scientists of different specialties to speak with each other who had never spoken with each other before. And that is a major restructuring of science, giving it the capacity for the first time to actually appreciate that there was a greenhouse effect.
Well, science for the first time has the capacity to measure its own impact on the world. I mean, the nuclear winter studies plus the CFC problem plus the CO2 problem. It's science that created these problems, yes, and that now reveals their magnitude as they bear down upon us.
Mm-hmm. So the accommodation of scientific view of history, archaeology, and so on in the church has to be matched by an equal resacralization of science. So I could say sacralization of science.
Yes, right.
Never had this connection in the past. That might be an essential connection in order for us to have a future.
Yes, the purpose of science should be the Greek purpose, to understand nature, not for techne. That all came later. We need to hold back from applications. That's the problem. I mean, let's just assimilate what we know at this level, try and save the earth, but not push deeper into application, because that is rape. That is this violation thing where, Taoists don't do it that way. They just are content to know how it works.
Well, all right, the catastrophe is coming. The revitalization of the church and the revision of science are already underway, and maybe in order to actually nucleate the social transformation that's implied and which will inevitably result if we're lucky, it requires a certain nucleation site, a model first exemplar of this coalition. And that might take place somewhere, maybe in England, in Holland or someone, I would guess, probably not in the United States. And then from this model to spread outward in the rapid diffusion amplified by the media and so on.
Yes, a green party, a psychedelic.
Maybe we should be working on this model system in some particular time and place.
Well, I think one local way in which it could be in which it might happen or could happen is in the northwest of the United States, where there are in place quite large numbers of people who've already ritualized mushroom cults. And there's an ongoing ritualized mushroom cult there, which is a psychedelically motivated, influenced by American Indian chants and American Indian practices, involves an awareness of, in some cases, at least the American Indian versions of the four directions and the basic principles of localization in sacred space, yet which is disconnected from churches, as far as I know, and which is not integrated into the green political movement. But there's a sense in which ingredients exist, just to take where we are now, I mean, the American West. Ingredients exist, I think, for such a syncretic movement to happen. I think influences direct experience of these ayahuasca churches from the Amazon could help to nucleate this synthesis. The syncretism that hasn't really happened is the formation, the integration of these orders with the Christian world, partly yes, because of a deep suspicion on both sides, and a kind of stereotyped anti-Christian view that people have developed in some kind of reaction against their Christian or Jewish background many, many years before, and have very rarely ever re-examined. I mean, it's an impenetrable barrier they erect against their ancestors and the entire tradition they've come from, and try to function somehow keeping it all out, but it doesn't, because it comes around, the archetypes work unconsciously. And so one gets, I've met members of the mushroom cult who've come across to me very much like Southern Baptist evangelists for it, and on inquiry I find their backgrounds are Southern Baptist. Anyway, this is one area where some of the ingredients, namely green politics, the existence of such cults, and an attempt to reintegrate them with the Judaic Christian traditions is going on. So there's a sense in which this is one area where such a syncretism could emerge. Now in England, one would first have to establish the mushroom cults, and there are lots of people who take the native psilocybin mushrooms, and the people who gather them, but I don't know whether they've developed into sort of circles, because the mushroom thing here developed, I suppose, under the influence of peyote circles and living traditions of sacramental use of plants. And these living traditions are living in America, but I don't think there are any continuous living ones in Europe.
Well, the inner order of the proposed church could grow mushrooms. It's very easily done.
But they'd have to import the ritual from America or something.
I think they have to develop their own. I think the way to do it, at least the way that the ayahuasca church person that we met suggested, as the way this ayahuasca cult happened in the Amazon was, first somebody took it, and Our Lady appeared to him in the form of Our Lady of the Forest, and told him to go into the jungle for 7 days, living only on roots and berries and so forth, alone, and at the end to take a large amount of this substance, the ayahuasca. Then she appeared to him again as Our Lady of the Forest and revealed the outlines of this ritual and its essential forms. These things have to be channeled. They have to grow through a channeling type experience. They have to be revealed rather than invented. And so I think that, say, a mushroom cult were to grow up in England, it would have to happen spontaneously under the guidance of after a suitable prayer. I don't know who would be the great patron of it. I mean, Glastonbury would probably be one of its sacred centres. But it would have to be revealed, the details of it, I think.
Well, there is a tradition, I guess, only not continuous, because it became extinct. Is that right? So the rediscovery of the Druidic rites or something could provide the model.
I think that it would have to be... The thing is, the Druidic rites are too far lost to be revived. And there was this 19th century-based attempt to revive the Druidic rites, and there are Druidic orders in England. There are quite a lot of them. They all quarrel with each other, and there's a plethora of these Druids. But mostly they've taken their doctrines from theosophists and reading esoteric books and so on. It's a kind of melange of Western esoteric knowledge that doesn't really have, to me at any rate, any convincing continuity with the mysteries of the Druidic past. So in a sense the tradition is lost, and it's hard to see how it could be recovered without it being a rather theatrical reinvention.
Well, except if you look how the Mexican mushroom religion does it, it's very logical. I mean, that's the way to do it. You do it in small circles at night with intentionality. There's song, there's prayer, there's silence. It's not a leap of imaginative vision to conceive of one of these ceremonies.
No, it's very easy to conceive of them, but for them to have a kind of authenticity in the eyes of those who participate in them, they have to have been revealed rather than invented.
Well, they are psychedelic experiences. The authenticity is going to come from the thing itself. We're not talking here about reciting mantras. This is the real thing, you know.
I know, but the thing is that the ceremony, I think, would need to be rooted in the spirit of the place and that sort of thing. There would have to be certain ritual elements for it to function, rather than to be rooted in the spirit of the place and to be part of a larger movement such as we're talking of, namely a green order, which would be the kind of mystical branch of a larger green movement.
Well, you see, what I'm trying to do in my book is argue that the mushroom was the symbiote of humanity, and that thus all human beings in all times and places can actually claim it as their...
So there's a gigantic creode.
Yes.
It should be possible to excavate it from any time at any place in the future.
That was the religion of human beings for the first million years. And it underwent a diminishing 10,000 years ago. And so the creode is vast.
Glacial.
Yes. With the desertification of Africa, it was broken up as recently as 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. There were probably still intermittent mushroom ceremonies when it climatically was favored to appear. But I really see it as a restoration of this lost symbiotic partner. So it isn't even ultimately a matter of the psychedelic experience per se. It's that psilocybin has some unique relationship to the evolution of the human nervous system. It in fact turns the human nervous system into an antenna to the Gaian mind, and then people behave appropriately in the same way that termites behave appropriately when within the morphogenetic field of the termite nest. But if this antenna is not present in the human being, then the human being has to think up their own program, and it's usually power-crazed, lethal, short-sighted, and grabby.
But if that's the case, do we know that the mushroom plants that have sprung up, for example, in the northwest of the United States, have these led to, is your impression of the people who belong to them that these are people of an entirely different quality from those who don't belong to such groups, and that they're appropriate and in tune with the Gaian mind?
Oh yes, they tend to be rural, they tend to be communal, they tend to be non-motivated in the economic realm. In other words, they are living simply. Voluntary simplicity is a concept they're well familiar with. They have and value their children. They're exemplifying the values that peasantry has always exemplified because they live near the land. They want for nothing, but they have very little. That's my impression.
They haven't a plan to take over the Christian churches.
No, they are beyond it. They are in the thrall of their religious relationship to the mushroom. The Save the Earth part is sort of the political agenda.
But they're going to be absorbed by this political program sooner or later as the acid rain destroys their mushrooms.
Yes, well, I think they're more and more alarmed. My audiences, until very recently, preferred me to dwell on the mystical, the transhistorical. They loved that. And about a year and a half ago, people started questioning why there was no political content. Now they demand political content. There is definitely a shift on to make whatever your position is relevant to the encroaching crisis which everyone feels. We may imagine because we're intellectuals and because we deal with this data that it's more on our minds, but the housewife doing her ironing, the school child on the bus, people worry about the fate of the earth because the collective information field has now shifted its attention to this. The only competition for that focus on the need to save the earth is this stupid anti-drug thing, which is, the need to preserve the purity of your precious bodily essences or something like that. And in a way, the two are opposed. It's an issue of how we relate to the vegetable matrix.
Yes, well, there we see the forces in opposition to the resacularization program gathering and arming themselves.
Yes, in their usual fashion.
But you see, I think the psychedelic order is only one aspect of the resacularization program. The other one, as I suggested the other day, is a revival of pilgrimage and sense of sacred time. And this can be done in many contexts, and it can be easily incorporated into people's lives. And moreover, I find that it immediately makes sense to most people. I mean, most people, you say, that the quality of time at certain times are better, and to be conscious of these, and to the kind of historical fields attached to them, is better than to be unconscious of them. I mean, most people can see that, and they say, of course. And the same with sacred places. Most people can see that the reason why pilgrims and tourists go to these places is because of some quality of the place which is special. And so do you relate to the quality of the space consciously and ask the spirit of the place to inform and illuminate you on your visit there and give you its blessing? Or do you treat it unconsciously and say, well, people thought that way in the past, but now we are scientific, we've risen above all that, that's just superstition, but we're interested in coming to this place anyway for historical or archaeological reasons and taking photographs of it and going home, but without opening oneself to the spirit of the place. One's relation to it being one of attraction to it, and yet an unconscious barrier between one. Now, if one puts it like that, I think most people can see that, because most people really are going to sacred places and really are going to the wilderness and so on because of a desire to make some such connection. It's part of the romantic, private, subjective tradition of our culture. But I think that making it explicit and pointing it out and showing how, in simple ways, how pilgrimage can be revived. I mean, simple principles like going with an intention, taking some offering, if possible circumambulating the place to make it the cosmic center before entering it, and simple principles of that kind. It's fairly easy to resacralize tourism, and that's something which is immediately available as a mass movement, and through the impetus of the green movement, I think could be spread very rapidly.
Well, I think we've arrived at a certain vision characterized by, to me, surprising optimism about the possible outcome of this program involving the green, the sacralization, the psychedelic orders, and the successful escape of the downward spiral up the down staircase. We're talking about up the down staircase. And the way it's emerged in our trialogue, I think it sounds fairly plausible that it's possible and it's underway.
You've got a summary.
I haven't the energy to summarize this, because every time I try to summarize it, you've added something further.
I think it's in good shape unless you feel a summary coming on, and I'll just shut up.
Well, a diagram. Ralph has this great ability to turn everything into diagrams.
Yes, well, we have a diagram in mind, definitely. We have, through poking around, rediscovered the basic institutions of civilization, the religious, the political, or the state, and the relationship to the earth. And then we've proposed revitalization of each of these areas and found them already underway. And then we've seen that the connection of these root revolutionary movements needs to be provided as a kind of a matrix between them, which would then integrate them into kind of a new social form with a chance of having a future. And this intracellular matrix between the roots could grow by evolution from a kind of a nucleation event. And so we've pinpointed something that actually we could do to provide this nucleation, and that would be a pilgrimage involving some small number of people from the green political movement and others from the new religious movements, for example, the councils of ayahuasca and peyote cults in the Americas, to give them a joint experience, sharing the spirit of the field of a traditional sacred place, particularly of the oldest roots of Western civilization. I don't know if we will actually do this, but we have at least dreamed up something we could do that has the potential of have a lot of bang for the buck in terms of giving people our idea for a new society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as the saying goes, a lot of water has passed under the bridge since Ralph's optimistic summation of ways to bring the sacred back into human civilization. I guess on one hand you could say that not much has changed, at least on the surface, but behind the scenes, at least in the psychedelic community, I can say that my personal experience has been to see many of my friends move from using psychedelic substances primarily for pleasure into more of a mystical dimension, which really isn't very surprising to anyone who has personally experienced these gratuitous graces. So maybe the resacularization of the world is actually taking place, just like the trialogues were hoping for. I guess my main criticism of this thread of their conversation stems from the fact that, for the most part, they were speaking from a Judeo-Christian perspective. Although Rupert did try to interject the Muslim side on a few occasions, for the most part they weren't able to also touch on the forms of Buddhism, Hinduism, and the wide varieties of religious experience available throughout the Far East. And it's not a criticism, actually. After all, they were covering a huge topic in just 90 minutes. And I'm mentioning this mainly because I know we have a large number of fellow psychonauts in that part of the world who also join us here in the Psychedelic Salon each week. And I don't want you to think that your point of view doesn't matter. It does. Unfortunately, us Westerners sometimes get so carried away with ourselves that we forget that we're only one small part of the human experience. And I have to admit that I had to smile when Terence kept talking about saving the earth. Now, while that expression was quite popular during the last century, it's become kind of funny now, don't you think? I can see talking about saving our species, and to be honest, I'm not sure we're going to even make it as a species as long as most mammal species have survived so far. But I'm pretty sure that no matter what us humans do, the Earth is going to continue along just fine. There's nothing wrong with talking about saving the planet, but unless and until we humans can get along with one another and with the biosphere, saving ourselves seems to be where the focus should be. And speaking of focus, I'd better come clean here and admit that my focus on replying to your email has really fallen by the wayside lately. I seem to go in spurts where for a few days I'll answer email as soon as it comes in, but then I'll start putting it off for a day or so until eventually my inbox gets so full I realize I'll probably never catch up. But this kind of procrastination isn't anything new for me. In my last assignment in the Navy, I was the executive officer on a ship, which meant, among other things, that I was responsible for the smooth flow of the mountains of mainly unnecessary paperwork that bureaucracies seem to thrive on. I can remember one program that the screwheads at the top of our system implemented, and it was supposedly intended to reduce the number of reports a ship was required to submit. But what really amazed me about this program was that the morons who came up with the idea required us to submit weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual reports detailing how we eliminated the unnecessary busy work of filing stupid reports. So, as you can probably guess, my first weekly report was to announce that I'd eliminated all of the reports about reducing paperwork. For the first few months after refusing to send any more of those stupid forms into them, I was getting all kinds of threatening messages telling me that I was way behind in reporting on my paperwork problems. But after a while, I guess they just got tired of bugging me, and I stopped hearing from them. So I expanded that idea and didn't turn in any reports for a few months. And it turned out that there were actually a few people who seemed to really need the information that I was supposed to be reporting on. So I wound up doing about 10% of the required paperwork because they were essentially very squeaky wheels. I guess this is just a long way of saying that I'm still not very good at paperwork, even the digital kind. It's rude of me, I know, particularly because I so enjoy receiving your emails. So, for what it's worth, if you haven't yet received a reply to an email you sent me, well, I want you to know that it really bothers me that I don't keep up with my email, and I even lose sleep about it at night as I lay there and compose responses to the many thoughtful messages you've been sending. And I promise to do better in my next life. Well, I'm just rambling now, I guess, so I'd better close and let you get on with your lives. Hey, it's been nice to be with you again, though, and thank you all for listening. Before I go, I want to mention that this and all of the podcasts from the Psychedelic Salon are protected under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 2.5 license. And if you have any questions about that, you can click on the link at the bottom of the Psychedelic Salon webpage, which may be found at matrixmasters.com/podcasts. And if you still have questions, send them to me in an email. It's lorenzo@matrixmasters.com. Thanks as always to Jacques Cordell and Wells of Chateau Hayuk for letting us use your music here in the Psychedelic Salon. And for now, this is Lorenzo, signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.